Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 154 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and art of game mastering. Not only do I pass along any knowledge I've gained over 25 plus years of running RPGs, I also share wisdom from guest GMs and listener GMs like you. Today, I continue my exploration of the DMG with a discussion of gods and deities in your world. We'll explore different types of pantheons and religious systems, and I'll provide some examples from my own homebrew world of Primordia. Join me on the journey. Together, we can become game masters truly worthy of the title. Hello, listener. Welcome back to Game Master's Journey. So great to be back talking about RPGs and game mastering. Really excited to dig back into the Dungeon Master Guide today, continuing on world building discussion, talking about gods and religion and pantheons and all that good stuff. But before we get into that, I have a couple announcements. I want to remind you that I have started running some of the adventures from the Tales from the Yawning Portal on my YouTube channel. We've started with the Hidden Shrine of Tamawakan and having a lot of fun with that. So definitely check that out on my YouTube channel. And we live stream that on Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific time. Also, my D&D adventure, The Trickster's Labyrinth, is now available for purchase at starwalkerstudios.com. Hope you'll check it out. Sold a few copies now, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from people what they think of it, and especially from anyone who runs or plays it, what they think of it. Had a lot of fun creating that, and want to thank my wife, Nikki, who did a lot of hard work on the art and the layout, and it looks fantastic. So we've got quite a bit of discussion about gods in your world today, straight from the pages of the Dungeon Master's Guide. So without further ado, let's proceed on with the show. Returning to our discussion of the DMG, we are in Part 1, Master of Worlds, Chapter 1, A World of Your Own. Today, we are going to talk about gods of your world. In Appendix B of the Player's Handbook, there are a number of pantheons, which are loose groupings of deities not united by a single doctrine or philosophy that you can use in your game, including the gods of established D&D worlds and fantasy historical pantheons. So you can easily use one of these pantheons for your campaign, or you could mix and match gods and ideas from different ones, however you wish. Now it says here, as far as the game's rules are concerned, it doesn't matter if your world has hundreds of deities or a church devoted to a single god. In rules terms, clerics choose domains, not deities, so your world can associate domains with deities in any way you choose. Or, I would point out, not at all. You could have a setting without deities at all, and your clerics just choose domains, and what those domains represent, if anything, is up to you. There are different ways that you can go as far as how you're going to approach the gods and religions in your world. And just like in our last discussion of the DMG, when we talked about the basic assumptions of a D&D world, there are certain assumptions that your standard D&D world makes. And one of those assumptions is that the deities are tied together in loose pantheons. So we're going to talk a bit about loose pantheons, which again is the system that a lot of the published D&D worlds use. And then we'll discuss some variations on that and different ways that you could approach it. But we'll start with loose pantheons. Most D&D worlds have a loose pantheon of gods. A multitude of deities rule the various aspects of existence, variously cooperating with and competing against one another to administer the affairs of the universe. People gather in public shrines to worship gods of life and wisdom, or meet in hidden places to venerate gods of deception or destruction. Each deity in a pantheon has a portfolio and is responsible for advancing that portfolio. So an example, in the Greyhawk setting, Hieronymus is a god of valor who calls clerics and paladins to his service and encourages them to spread the ideals of honorable warfare, chivalry, and justice in society. Even in the midst of his everlasting war with his brother Hector, god of war and tyranny, Hieronymus promotes his own portfolio, war fought nobly and in the cause of justice. People in most D&D worlds are polytheistic, honoring deities of their own and acknowledging pantheons of other cultures. So this is an important point, that the people in the setting are polytheistic, which is to say that they believe in multiple gods and they worship or honor multiple gods. So, again, this idea of like a player character who's a paladin or a cleric who follows one specific god, that's the exception, not the rule. Most people follow a multitude of gods in these settings. Goes on to say individuals pay homage to various gods regardless of alignment. In the Forgotten Realms, a person might propitiate Umberlee before setting out to sea, join a communal feast to celebrate Shantea at harvest time, and pray to Malar before going hunting. So again, each god is representing a portfolio or a suite of ideas and aspects of the civilized world. And so you interact with a certain deity when you're interacting with that aspect of the world. So if you have a deity of the hunt, then you're going to interact with that deity when you go hunting. If you have a deity of the ocean and storms, you're going to interact with that deity when you sail on the sea. So just as people interact with various aspects of civilization and nature throughout their day-to-day lives, so in the same way, they're going to interact with different deities. Some individuals feel a calling to a particular deity service and claim that god as a patron. Particularly devoted individuals become priests by setting up a shrine or helping to staff a holy site. Much more rarely, those who feel such a calling become clerics or paladins invested with the responsibility of true divine power. So again, these are the exceptions, and the exception to the rule is the person who reveres a specific deity so much that they're going to be a priest and maybe set up a shrine or something like that. And even more of an exception is the person who becomes a cleric or a paladin, or you could say who becomes a player character. Shrines and temples serve as community gathering points for religious rites and festivals. Priests at such sites relate stories of the gods, teach the ethics of their patron deities, offer advice and blessings, perform religious rites, and provide training and activities their deities favor. Cities and large towns can host several temples dedicated to individual gods important to the community, while smaller settlements might have a single shrine devoted to any gods the locals revere. So this is a great way that you can flesh out your setting and establish some setting by how you approach the different shrines and churches that exist wherever you're telling your story. So, if you're telling a story in a small village or a small town, maybe there's only one shrine that is devoted to a handful of gods that are important to those people. On the other hand, if you're running a story in a larger town or a city, there might be numerous temples and shrines, each one dedicated to one specific deity or dedicated to a few deities that are seen to work hand in hand. And another cool thing you can do with these temples and shrines, especially when you're talking about in a larger city, is you can have them fulfill functions above and beyond just being a religious site. So, for instance, maybe you have a god who's a god of knowledge and learning, and there is a church to this god in a big city. Well, it's not just a church like what we would think of a church where you go and make offerings and worship the god and have ceremonies and stuff like that. It might also be a library. It might be the library of the city. Since this is a god of knowledge, many of the people who serve this god do so in the capacity of a librarian and a curator of knowledge. So it just makes sense that a church to this deity would be a library. And that's also a way that you can kind of pull in aspects of the gods or of religion, even when you have a group that doesn't have any divine characters, doesn't have any clerics or paladins. So maybe none of your player characters are clerics or paladins or anything like that, but maybe they need to do some research. And to do research, they're going to go to the god of knowledge's church in the city. So for instance, in Primordia, the god of knowledge is Ion. So her library might be the best place to go to find obscure lore. And so as the player characters go to this place to do their research, they're interacting with clerics and priests of Ion. And that can be a great way if you have something to do with this god that you want to bring into the story. That can be a great way you can introduce it. So one thing I would recommend, if you're fleshing out a city or you're thinking about the different gods in your world, is think about what functions would a church of this god serve in a larger community. And you can get some cool ideas that way. So it says here, to quickly build a pantheon for your world, you could create a single god for each of the 8 domains available to clerics: death, knowledge, life, light, nature, tempest, trickery, and war. You can invent names and personalities for these deities or borrow deities from other pantheons. This approach gives you a small pantheon that covers the most significant aspects of existence, and it's easy enough to extrapolate other areas of life each deity controls. The god of knowledge, for example, might also be patron of magic and prophecy, while the god of light might be the sun god and the god of time. So I will just take issue with one thing here, is they say that this approach gives you a small pantheon that covers the most significant aspects of existence. That's not really true. This approach gives you a pantheon that covers the domains. So it covers the most significant aspects of the game mechanics of playing a cleric. But, I don't think that the domains that they've chosen really represent the core aspects of existence. I think some of the domains are a little too focused for that. And I think that there are core aspects of existence that are blatantly missing. So we then have some discussion of a sample pantheon called the Dawnward deities, which is this kind of hodgepodge pantheon they came up with, I think, for 4th edition. So this has some Forgotten Realms gods. It's got some of the racial gods. It's got a couple gods from mythology. It's just kind of this hodgepodge of deities. I'm not super impressed with it personally, and I would recommend before you use something like this that you pick an actual pantheon that fits your setting. So if you're running in Dragonlance, then use those gods, obviously. Or if you're doing your own setting, then I would come up with your own gods, or do like they said and come up with a god for each domain. And you can either come up with those from scratch, or you can borrow deities from other pantheons. Those could be other D&D pantheons. They could be deities from other games, like a video game you like, or something like that, or a fantasy series, or they could be deities from actual real world pantheons throughout history, however you want to do it. So that's the loose pantheon, which is, kind of the assumption, kind of the stock D&D setting. So, if you do that, you're going to be in good company with many D&D settings, and there's not really many surprises there. But now we're going to talk about different ways you could approach this. So instead of a loose pantheon, you could have a tight pantheon. In contrast to a loose pantheon, a tight pantheon focuses on a single religion whose teachings and edicts embrace a small group of deities. Followers of a tight pantheon might favor one of its member deities over another, but they respect all the deities and honor them with sacrifices and prayer as appropriate. The key trait to a tight pantheon is that its worshippers embrace a single ethos or dogma that includes all the deities. The gods of the tight pantheon work as one to protect and guide their followers. You can think of a tight pantheon as similar to a family. One or two deities who lead the pantheon serve as parent figures, with the rest serving as patrons of important aspects of the culture that worships the pantheon. A single temple honors all members of the pantheon. Most type pantheons have one or more aberrant gods, deities whose worship isn't sanctioned by the priests of the pantheon as a whole. These are usually evil deities and enemies of the pantheon, such as the Greek Titans. These deities have cults of their own, attracting social outcasts and villains to their worship. These cults resemble mystery cults, their members strictly devoted to their single god, though even members of aberrant cults pay lip service in the temples of the type pantheon. The Norse deities serve as an example of a type pantheon. Odin is the pantheon's leader and father figure. Deities such as Thor, Tyr, Freya embody important aspects of Norse culture. Meanwhile, Loki and his devotees lurk in the shadows, sometimes aiding the other deities and sometimes working against them with the pantheon's enemies. So that's a way you could go. You could, instead of doing the loose pantheon, you could do the tight pantheon. And I think this is really effective for kind of a more tight-knit setting where you want kind of everything really drilling down and focus to what this culture is really about. And all of these gods kind of work together as a team in a way, and they all reinforce one another, as opposed to a loose pantheon like what you see in the Forgotten Realms, where in a lot of ways each god is kind of off doing their own thing, and they're not all connected to each other in that way. Another option is mystery cults. A mystery cult is a secretive religious organization based on a ritual of initiation in which the initiate is mystically identified with a god or a handful of related gods. Mystery cults are intensely personal, concerned with the initiate's relationship with the divine. Sometimes a mystery cult is a type of worship within a pantheon. It acknowledges the myths and rituals of the pantheon, but represents its own myths and rites as primary. For instance, a secretive order of monks might immerse themselves in a mystical relationship to a god who is a part of a broadly worshipped pantheon. A mystery cult emphasizes the history of its god, which is symbolically reenacted in its initiation ritual. The foundation myth of a mystery cult is usually simple and often involves a god's death and rising, or a journey to the underworld and a return. Mystery cults often revere sun and moon deities and agricultural deities, gods whose portfolios reflect the cycles of nature. The cult's ritual of initiation follows the pattern of its foundation myth. Neophytes retrace the god's footsteps in order to share the god's ultimate fate. In the case of dying and rising gods, the symbolic death of the initiate represents the idea of death to the old life and rebirth into a transformed existence. Initiates are born into a new life, remaining in the world of mortal affairs but feeling elevated to a higher sphere. The initiate is promised a place in the god's realm after death, but also experiences new meaning in life. And just a few things about the mystery cults here. First of all, they don't really come out and tell you it, but a big part of the name mystery cults is mystery. And these are oftentimes very secretive organizations. People who are not members of the mystery cult may not even know that it exists, or even if they know it exists, they know very little about it. And even those who are petitioning to join the cult commonly don't really know much, if anything, about the workings of the cult until they pass through this initiation ceremony. So I think mystery cults are really cool. And it's something I definitely plan to use in Primordia. So to kind of illustrate some of these concepts we're talking about, I'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing with the gods in Primordia. So first of all, the gods in Primordia are a loose pantheon. I have thoughts of eventually going into details of the gods and creating a lot of connections among them, similar to what we see in the ancient Greek pantheon, where we see, this god is the father of that god, and this god is the sister of that god. And, it's not necessarily a fully tight pantheon where all the gods are related together, but there are a lot of lines of connection among the gods. And a lot of those are, gods who are brothers or sisters or parents or daughters or sons and things like that. And I think eventually I'd like to get to that point with the gods of Primordia. I don't think I'll ever get to the point where it's a truly tight pantheon, although I might, but I'm not planning that right now. But I would like to flesh out some of those relationships. I do have one concept, though, that is a little different than the standard loose pantheon approach, and that is the Church of the Nine. So I did what was suggested here and took the domains and came up with a god for each domain, only I have 9 because I also included the Arcana domain from the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. However, I thought about the fact that, you've got 9 different deities. They all have their own spheres of influence. They all have different ways that they can be approached and appeased. And I thought, most people really don't want to deal with it. When they really need a good crop or it's planting season or harvest season, they might want to beseech the agricultural god for a blessing. Basically when there's something they want from the gods, right? Then suddenly they want to be involved with the gods. But the rest of the time, they really don't. And they more honor the gods and capitulate to the gods out of a sense of obligation or out of fear, wanting to avoid coming into disfavor with the gods, than it is a thing of something they really want to do. I also wanted to play around with the ideas of religions as political institutions. So with the help of some of the listeners and previous Primordia discussions, we came up with this idea of the Church of the Nine, which is a very political organization and represents all 9 of the gods and is something that you find in the city. So for instance, in the city of Alandria, there is the Church of the Nine, and they have an actual church. And you go there, and kind of like what they were talking about with shrines in small villages, it's a church that's dedicated to all 9 of the deities. The idea is that the officials of the Church of the Nine kind of take a lot of the headache of dealing with the gods out of your hands and take care of it themselves. And just like any business that is going to add convenience to your life, they're going to charge a price for that. And members of the church pay that charge in the form of offerings and donations that, instead of being given to a specific god or offered to a specific god, are instead given to the church. And the idea is that the church is kind of this mediating body between the people and the gods, and kind of the deal that the church makes with its members is all you need to do is give your offerings to the church, pay your tithes to the church, whatever that might be, and that's determined by the church. And then they don't really have to worry about appeasing all the different gods and what offerings the different gods want and when they want them and things like that. And the church will approach the gods on their behalf and take care of all the red tape for them. So the kind of interesting thing about that, or what I find interesting about it, is that in a lot of ways, the Church of the Nine is almost, you could almost call it like a secular organization. They're not, they're more political. They don't really, I'm trying to think how to say this. Like if you had a character in Primordia who was a really devout follower of a god, that character most likely would not be a member of the Church of the Nine. The Church of the Nine is for people that just don't want their lives to be hindered by the gods and would like to receive any blessings that they can from the gods, but don't really care about the gods and don't really want to care about the gods. They just want to live their lives and do what they need to do and not worry about it. And even so far as the officials in the church, that's kind of their approach. And the church itself is really more of a business that makes money by taking the offerings from the members of the church and then using that money how they see fit and going through the emotions and giving the appearances that they're interceding on their members' behalf with the gods. But again, someone who is really devoted to a certain god would not approach that god by becoming a member of the Church of the Nine or going through the Church of the Nine. And instead, what that person would do would seek out the mystery cult that's devoted to that god. So my idea is that the truly faithful in Primordia either just kind of worship the gods in their own way on their own, kind of the old-fashioned method, before the Church of the Nine came about, where each person just approached the gods on their own and made the right offerings on the right days and did the right ceremonies and just did their best to be right with the gods. So someone who really believed in the gods and really wanted to honor the gods would either go that route, or if there were one or a few gods that they were especially drawn to, they would seek out the mystery cults for those gods and participate in them. Now, from kind of a more game mechanics or a more game perspective, what I want to do with the mystery cults is make them actual organizations in the game, in the world. So like in the Forgotten Realms, you have the Lord's Alliance and the Emerald Enclave and all that stuff, the Harpers. Similar things, that the mystery cults would be organizations like that. And player characters could try to become members of one or more of these cults. And once they became members, then the cults as organizations would have ranks, and each rank would have privileges and responsibilities. And I will use the renown system that we'll get to later in the DMG to track where a given PC is in regards to a given mystery cult. So they will earn renown with these organizations by performing ceremonies, giving offerings, going on quests, things like that, doing things for the god, doing things more specifically for the mystery cult. And as they accrue renown, they will gain higher rank within the cult and be inducted into deeper mysteries of that particular cult. And what I really want to do with this is have, not only will there be political and social and maybe even economic benefits for getting ranks in these cults, like, you have contacts and you have resources that you can draw upon, but there will also be mechanical benefits in the form of abilities. Like for instance, the equivalent of blessings or charms from the DMG, where you can get the effect of a potion or a spell that is granted to you by the mystery cult, or more directly, really by that deity. And I think I can do a few things with this. First of all, for a player, which they seem few and far between, but for a player who really wants to interact with the gods or with a specific god and really wants a part of their character to be their relationship with this god and their relationship with an organization devoted to the god, it's kind of a mini game for that player, because in addition to their character's level and what they're doing with the main story or whatever that is of the campaign, they also have their standing within this mystery cult. And as they do more for the cult, as they gain renown with the cult and they gain rank within the cult, they actually get benefits. And those benefits could be money, could be contacts and allies, and could be actual abilities, whether those are feats that maybe they gain or spells that they can use so many times per day. And one thing I'd like to do with this is have this be a way that any character, really, no matter what their class, could get access to some limited cleric abilities. So, one issue that I've noticed with 5th edition and earlier versions of D&D is a lot of times I encounter groups of players where no one wants to play a cleric or no one wants to play a healer type character. And I talked about this in a series of episodes I did about improving the cleric and how to make the cleric a more appealing character that more players will want to play. So I don't want to go off on a huge tangent on this because I have discussed it elsewhere in the show, and it might be a good topic to cover in another episode. But when you look at 5th edition specifically, the best classes in the game to fulfill the function of being the quote healer for a party is the cleric and the bard. Kind of a runner-up would be the druid, followed then by the paladin and ranger. But the best is the cleric and the bard. And the reasons that I say those characters are the best is the obvious. They get access to all of the healing spells. Also, they get access to resurrection magics like raise dead and resurrection and revivify. And also, and just as important, and I think sometimes overlooked, they get access to the spells lesser and greater restoration. So in 5th edition, we've removed some of the need for having a quote healer in a group of PCs as far as regaining hit points with the short rest mechanic. So in earlier versions of the game, you had to rest often for days to regain lost hit points if you didn't have some form of magical healing. And we've mitigated that to a large degree in 5th edition because you can take short rests and you can roll hit dice to get hit points back. But you still need a healer for any kind of returning from the dead, which, that to me is not so necessary because you can easily play a game where no one in the party has access to revivify or raise dead or resurrection or reincarnate. And it doesn't, you can still play the game. It doesn't really matter. It's not really going to be a problem. The only real thing is that, anytime a PC dies, either that player is going to have to make a new character or bringing that character back to life is going to be a little more involved because they're going to need to find an NPC that can bring that character back. It's not really going to be that much involved because really the biggest limiting factor when it comes to bringing characters back from the dead in 5th edition is the cost of the material components for the spells, which are pretty expensive. Compared to that cost, when you're talking 500 or 1,000 or 300 gold pieces worth of diamonds or a diamond, compared to that cost, the amount that you would have to pay an NPC spellcaster to actually cast a spell is pretty small in comparison. The biggest part of that cost is going to be for that component, and that cost is the same whether the person casting the spell is a player character or a non-player character. So I'd say, we can almost kind of shelve the quote need for someone to cast resurrection magic as far as needing a healer because, you can get that from an NPC or you can just get by without it. We can also kind of shelve the need for magical healing in the form of regaining hit points, again, because you have the short rest that can do that for you as long as you can take a short rest. So really, in my mind, what a party really needs a healer for is for lesser and greater restoration, is for those times when a character is diseased or poisoned or cursed, and they need some way to get rid of that. Now, that again is something that you can potentially get from an NPC, but it can be problematic because the player characters might be in a remote location. Someone gets cursed and it's a very debilitating curse. And it may be difficult or even impossible to get that character to a town where they can find an NPC who can cast lesser or greater restoration. So in my mind, when I'm looking at a group of players and I'm looking at the adventures I want to take them through and I'm thinking about, is this going to be a problem because they don't have a quote healer? A lot of times what it really comes down to is, do they have access to the restoration spells or not? And if they don't, are there going to be times in the course of the campaign where that's going to be a big problem? So when we look at characters that have access to the restoration spells, the ones that are going to get those spells the soonest are the bard and the cleric. Now, the paladin, and I believe the ranger also does get access to those spells, but because they're not full casters, they get them at higher level than the bard and cleric does. So if you have a group of players and no one's playing a bard or a cleric or a paladin or ranger, in short, no one has access to the restoration spells, that can be an issue. So these mystery cults and what I want to do with them is a way to help mitigate that, because those would definitely be spells that I would give access to via a mystery cult. So you get high enough rank in a mystery cult, as long as it's a deity that it makes sense they would grant that power. Maybe you get the ability to cast Lesser Restoration once per day, or once per week, or once per month, something like that. Same with Greater Restoration. I could also do that with healing spells, and maybe even at the highest ranks in the mystery cult, you get Revivify or Raise Dead or Resurrection that you can cast once a week or once a month or once a year or whatever. And, I could limit the frequency of the spell. So maybe you can only cast it once a month or once a year. So, it's not going to be as reliable of a resource as if you had a bard or cleric in a party. But if you really need it, you have access to it. So I think that that's a way that I could mitigate the fact that, not every party is going to have a cleric or a bard. And even in the case of the bard, even if you have a bard, that bard player may not choose those spells in their limited list of spells that they know. So if they don't know restoration, then, it's not much use to them unless they can find a scroll or a wand or something that has that spell. And also, these mystery cults can be a way that any player can get some magical abilities if they want. So, in addition to the whole idea of, this is a way that we could mitigate not having an actual healer in the party, it's also a way that a character like a battle master fighter who has no magical ability to speak of could gain some magical ability if they wanted to, without having to spend a feat for it or without having to multi-class for it. So as I develop these mystery cults, I'll come up with, for each mystery cult, come up with the different ranks and what level of renown you need to gain each rank. I will probably, because I'm going to have spell-like abilities associated with these ranks, I will also have a level requirement. So a certain rank may not only require a certain level of renown to reach that rank, but you may also have to be a certain level. Like you have to be at least 5th level before you can achieve that rank. And then that way, 3rd level characters aren't getting 3rd level spell-like abilities, and I can keep everything in line with what it should be. I would also probably limit the spell-like abilities to 1 level beneath what a full caster of that level would be. So for instance, at 5th level, you gain, if you're a full caster like a cleric or a druid or a wizard or a bard, at 5th level, you gain access to 3rd level spells. So, a person who's 5th level and member of a mystery cult at the highest rank they can be at that level, maybe they would only get access to 1st or 2nd level spells, but they wouldn't probably get access to any 3rd level spells, because, I don't want it to be as good as being a caster. And then the higher rank you are in a mystery cult, you can more call upon aid from other members of the cult, whether that would be resources or actual, someone to help you in some way by casting a spell for you or by coming on an adventure with you or whatever. I can also use the mystery cults to illustrate even different factions within a given god's followers. So the gods of Primordia have different aspects that represent how different groups of people see that god and approach that god. So those different aspects could have their own mystery cults, and those mystery cults could be very different as far as what their goals are and how they operate and what abilities you can gain from them. And the idea is, because people in these worlds are polytheistic, that it's at least theoretically possible that a player character could be a member of more than one mystery cult. I think that there would be a practical limit, just because there's only so much you can do in a day, and a mystery cult is going to have expectations. They're going to want you to do things for them, especially if you want to advance through the ranks. So, there'd probably be a limit to how many you could be a member of any standing in, just because you only have so much time in which to do the things that all these different cults would want you to do. But it'll be a fun thing to play with.
This is Shane from the Total Party Thrill podcast, and you're listening to Lex Starwalker on Game Master's Journey.
I want to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Starwalker Studios. The support of the patrons makes this show possible. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to give a little back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. Patrons get some cool perks like game material I make for Primordia and access to a special monthly podcast I produce just for the patrons. I'd also like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Tier 4 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve.
You the man.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all the patrons. You can find out more about becoming a patron by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. So we've talked about loose pantheons and tight pantheons and mystery cults. Another variation you can consider is instead of using polytheism, you could use monotheism in your world. Monotheistic religions revere only one deity and in some cases deny the existence of any other deity. If you introduce a monotheistic religion into your campaign, you need to decide whether other gods exist. Even if they don't, other religions can exist side by side with the monotheistic religion. If these religions have clerics with spellcasting ability, their spells might be powered by one true deity, by lesser spirits who aren't deities, possibly including powerful aberrations, celestials, fae, fiends, or elementals, or simply by their faith. So yeah, if you're going to use monotheism, you could decide, is there only one God in this world? And any religion other than the one that follows this one God are drawing power from something else? Or are there multiple gods in the world and just this particular religion just follows one? So alongside, in this land, we have this monotheistic religion with one God, and in a neighboring land, they have a loose pantheon or a tight pantheon. And it really just depends how complex you want to get and how much you want conflict between different types of religions and different religions to be a major theme in your world. The deity of a monotheistic religion has an extensive portfolio and is portrayed as the creator of everything, in control of everything, and concerned with every aspect of existence. Thus, a worshiper of this god offers prayers and sacrifices to the same god regardless of what aspect of life is in need of divine assistance. Whether marching into war, setting off on a journey, or hoping to win someone's affections, the worshiper prays to the same god. Some monotheistic religions describe different aspects of their deity. A single god appears in different aspects as the creator and the destroyer, and the clerics of that god focus on one aspect or the other, determining their domain access and possibly even their alignment on that basis. A cleric who venerates the destroyer aspect chooses a tempest or war domain, while one who worships a creator aspect chooses the life or nature domains. In some monotheistic religions, clerics group themselves into distinct religious orders to differentiate clerics who choose different domains. So those are all, things you can consider. Now, one thing I would just add to this is if you're going to have different religious systems in the same world, like over here it's polytheistic and over here it's monotheistic, then you really want to think about whether you're really going to give that monotheistic God access to all the domains. Because if you do that, you're kind of saying, well, this monotheistic God is more powerful than the polytheistic ones. Because the polytheistic gods, maybe they've only got 1 or 2 or 3 domains, while the monotheistic God has all of them. So that's something you want to think about. Another approach to religion that you could use in your world is dualism. A dualistic religion views the world as a stage for a conflict between two diametrically opposed deities or divine forces. Most often, the opposed forces are good and evil, or opposed deities representing those forces. In some pantheons, the forces or deities of law and chaos are the fundamental opposites in a dualistic system. Life and death, light and darkness, matter and spirit, body and mind, health and illness, purity and defilement, positive energy and negative energy. The D&D universe is full of polar opposites that could serve as a foundation for a dualistic religion. So obviously, imagining a religion that believes in a good and an evil God, that's not much of a stretch and isn't going to be anything terribly new or different. However, some of these other dualities, could take you to really interesting places, like law versus chaos, life versus death, light and darkness, matter and spirit, et cetera, et cetera. So, this could be an interesting springboard to take you in a direction where you're going to end up with deities and religions that are very different than someplace like the Forgotten Realms. Whatever the terms in which the dualism is expressed, half of the pair is usually believed to be good, beneficial, desirable, or holy, while the other half is considered bad, if not explicitly evil. If the fundamental conflict in a religion is expressed as the opposition between matter and spirit, the followers of that religion believe that one of the two, usually matter, is evil and the other, spirit, is good, and so seek to liberate their spirits from this material world and its evils through asceticism and contemplation. So you could go that way. It's kind of a simplistic approach, or even better, I would say that there are followers of both sides of the duality, and each believes that the side they follow is the, quote, good side, and the other side is the evil side. So in their matter spirit example, you could have followers of the god of matter who believe that matter is the good thing, and the real concrete world that you can see and feel and taste and hear is what matters, and that the spirit world is illusions that are there to lead you astray and provide confusion, while on the other side of the table, those who follow the spirit God believe that the spirit is good and true and holy, and that the world of matter is there to distract you from spiritual concerns. Each group believes that their side is right and the other side is wrong. Rare dualistic systems believe that the two opposing forces must remain in balance, always pulling away from each other, but remaining bound together in creative tension. So there you go. And, there's more here about dualistic systems. If that's something that interests you, it goes into some more discussion and talks about how in a dualistic system, each of these deities is going to have pretty large portfolios with multiple domains. And yeah, there's all kinds of stuff to consider there. Next, we have a discussion of animism, which is the belief that spirits inhabit every part of the natural world. In an animistic worldview, everything has a spirit, from the grandest mountain to the lowliest rock, from the great ocean to a babbling brook, from the sun and moon to a fighter's ancestral sword. All these objects and the spirits that inhabit them are sentient, though some are more aware, alert, and intelligent than others. The most powerful spirits might even be considered deities. All are worthy of respect, if not veneration. Animists don't typically pay allegiance to one spirit over the others. Instead, they offer prayers and sacrifices to different spirits at different times, as appropriate to the situation. A pious character might make daily prayers and offerings to ancestor spirits and the spirits of the house, regular petitions to important spirits such as the seven fortunes of good luck, occasional sacrifices of incense to location spirits such as the spirit of a forest, and sporadic prayers to a host of other spirits as well. An animistic religion is often very tolerant. Most spirits don't care to whom a character also offers sacrifices, as long as they receive the sacrifices and respect they are due. As new religions spread through animist lands, those religions typically win adherents but not converts. People incorporate new spirits and deities into their prayers without displacing the old ones. Contemplatives and scholars adopt complex philosophical systems and practices without changing their belief in and respect for the spirits they already venerate. Animism functions as a large, tight pantheon. Animist clerics serve the pantheon as a whole, and so can choose any domain representing a favorite spirit for that cleric. So yeah, mechanically and as far as how the religion works, it's very similar to the loose pantheon. It's really more a difference of flavor in a lot of ways. But animism is totally a way you can go. And again, you can easily imagine a very rich and varied world where all of these different types of religious systems exist in different places in the world. And then you can play with the conflicts that happen when they interact with one another. And finally, we have forces and philosophies. Not all divine powers need to be derived from deities. In some campaigns, believers hold enough conviction in their ideas about the universe that they gain magical power from that conviction. In other campaigns, impersonal forces of nature or magic replace the gods by granting power to mortals attuned to them, so kind of like the Force in Star Wars. Just as druids and rangers can gain their spell ability from the force of nature rather than from a specific nature deity, some clerics devote themselves to ideals rather than to a god. Paladins might serve a philosophy of justice and chivalry rather than a specific deity. So this is another world building element and something you can think about. In your world, do all clerics and paladins follow a specific deity? Do even rangers and druids follow a specific deity? Or can they follow nature itself or a philosophy or either? Is it all one way or the other, or do all of these exist in your world? It's something to think about. Forces and philosophies aren't worshipped. They aren't beings that can hear and respond to prayers or accept sacrifices. Devotion to a philosophy or a force isn't necessarily exclusive of service to a deity. A person can be devoted to the philosophy of good and offer worship to various good deities, or revere the force of nature and also pay homage to the gods of nature, or spirits of nature if you're going with animism, who might be seen as personal manifestations of an impersonal force. In a world that includes deities with demonstrable power through their clerics, it's unusual for a philosophy to deny the existence of deities, although a common philosophical belief states that the deities are more like mortals than they would have mortals believe. According to such philosophies, the gods aren't truly immortal, just very long-lived, and mortals can attain divinity. In fact, ascending to godhood is the ultimate goal of some philosophies. The power of a philosophy stems from the belief that mortals invest in it. A philosophy that only one person believes in isn't strong enough to bestow magical power on that person. So there you go. There's another way you could go. Now, one thought that I would give you when you're deciding how to approach religion in your world and whether, it's all going to be a loose pantheon or it's all going to be a tight pantheon, or you're going to go full animism or a dualistic approach, or forces and philosophies, or you're going to combine different ones or have different ones in different places. One thought I offer is whatever you decide to do or whatever you're considering doing, be sure to consider the impact that that's going to have. And if there is anything that is going to be changed or is going to no longer be usable in the game because of it. So for instance, there are beings that are closely tied to the gods and the idea of a loose pantheon, like avatars and angels and other celestials, the Empyreans, even demons and devils and things like that. So, think about, if I go this certain route with how I want to do religion, does that invalidate angels? And does that mean that I can no longer use angels from the monster manual as something that the players might encounter? And if so, do I care? Or is there maybe a way I can reskin angels as something else that will fit in my world? And again, I'm not saying don't do a certain thing if it means you can't use angels anymore, but that's something you want to think about and realize, and not be surprised later on down the road when you've worked everything out and fleshed everything out and presented it to your players. And then you realize, oh crap, I can't use angels anymore. And I really like angels and I'm really bummed I can't use them. So it's always better to figure things out ahead of time and be sure that you're going in a direction that you're going to be happy with. So now we have finally in this section an interesting discussion on humanoids, and specifically humans and their relationship with the gods. And this too is an assumption that you do not have to make in your world. So let's see what it has to say. Humanoids and the gods. When it comes to the gods, humans exhibit a far wider range of beliefs and institutions than other races do. In many D&D settings, orcs, elves, dwarves, goblins, and other humanoids have tight pantheons. It is expected that an orc will worship Grumsh or one of a handful of subordinate deities. In comparison, humanity embraces a staggering variety of deities. Each human culture might have its own array of gods. It's definitely the case in the Forgotten Realms, right? I mean, you've got an elven pantheon and a drow elven pantheon, which are both type pantheons. You've got the dwarven pantheon and the orc pantheon and the dragon pantheon and the giant pantheon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in the humans, it's like, have all kinds of pantheons. You know, they worship different gods in different parts of the realms. They have completely different pantheons. In most D&D settings, there is no single god that can claim to have created humanity. Thus, the human proclivity for building institutions extends to religion. This is something they say in the DMG here, and I don't think we've gotten into this yet, but they make this claim that humans are different and special because they build institutions. Like the elves and the dwarves don't do that, which really doesn't make sense when you think about it for more than 5 seconds. But that's a claim that they make, and you can run with that if you want, or you can strike that out as you see fit. A single charismatic prophet can convert an entire kingdom to the worship of a new god. With that prophet's death, the religion might wax or wane, or the prophet's followers might turn against one another and found several competing religions. In comparison, religion in Dwarven society is set in stone. The dwarves of the Forgotten Realms identify Moradin as their creator. While individual dwarves might follow other gods, as a culture, the dwarves are pledged to Moradin and the pantheon he leads. His teachings and magic are so thoroughly ingrained in Dwarven culture that it would take a cataclysmic shift to replace him. With that in mind, consider the role of the gods in your world and their ties to different humanoid races. Does each race have a creator god? How does that god shape that race's culture? Are other folk free of such divine ties and free to worship as they wish? Has a race turned against the god that created it? Has a new race appeared, created by a god within the last few years? A deity might also have ties to a kingdom, noble line, or other cultural institution. With the death of the emperor, a new ruler might be selected by divine portents sent by the deity who protected the empire in its earliest days. In such a land, the worship of other gods might be outlawed or tightly controlled. Finally, consider the difference between gods who are tied to a specific humanoid races and gods with more diverse followers. Do the races with their own pantheons enjoy a place of privilege in your world, with their gods taking an active role in their affairs? Are the other races ignored by the gods, or are those races the deciding factor that can tilt the balance of power in favor of one god or another? So yeah, these are all good questions, and these are all good things to consider. And again, like I've said about other things in this discussion, not only think about how you want to answer these questions, but think about how that's going to impact your world and what are the consequences of going that way. So for instance, if you go with the idea that every race out there has a deity that created that race and even a pantheon for that specific race, then you're going to run into the same problem that we have in the realms, where you have multiple gods over the same portfolios and domains. If you see that as a problem, I see that as a problem. I have a problem with having multiple gods of war and multiple gods of love and multiple gods of this, that, and the other thing. But you're going to end up with that if you have pantheons for all the different races and creators for all the different races. So the way I've approached this in Primordia is I have decided that there is only one pantheon in Primordia. There are the 9 gods, and that's it. And I address the question of diversity and the fact that not every god is going to, or not every race is going to approach gods in the same way through my concept of aspects. So instead of saying, every race has their own god of war and every nation has their own god of war and there's all these different gods of war running around, instead, how I approach it is there is only one god of war. However, different nations or different races may perceive that god of war in different ways. And the god of war is okay with that, and indeed has an aspect of himself or herself that fits the way that race or that culture or that nation approaches that particular god. I view it almost like facets on a gem. Yes, there is a being that is the god of war. However, that being can appear however it wishes. It can appear as male. It can appear as female. It can appear as a dwarf. It can appear as an elf. So, everybody's narcissistic, of course. So everybody sees a deity in their own image. So when the dwarves see the god of war, they see a dwarf. When the elves see the god of war, they see an elf. And you could even have the god appear to a diverse group of people, and each person is seeing something different. They're all seeing what they expect to see. But there's only one god of war. I even go so far as allowing different aspects of a god to have, quote, have different alignments. In Primordia, the gods don't have alignment. Alignment is a mortal conception. The gods are beyond that. However, a specific aspect of a god might have an alignment, or more correctly, might be seen to have a given alignment. So a certain culture might worship the god of death and perceive death to be a chaotic and evil deity. Another culture might worship the death and perceive death as being a lawful, neutral deity. Another culture might perceive death as a chaotic, neutral deity, and so on and so on. So that's the way I've approached it and tried to have a manageable and relatively small number of gods, but still be able to have very different peoples in different places who have very different ideas of what the gods are and what they want and how to appease them. There's also a sidebar in this section called divine rank. The divine beings of the multiverse are often categorized according to their cosmic power. Some gods are worshipped on multiple worlds and have a different rank on each world, depending on their influence there. So we're going to start at the highest level and go down to lower and lower levels. So at the top, we've got greater deities. Greater deities are beyond mortal understanding. They can't be summoned, and they are almost always removed from direct involvement in mortal affairs. On very rare occasions, they manifest avatars similar to lesser deities, but slaying a greater god's avatar has no effect on the god itself. Next, we have lesser deities. Lesser deities are embodied somewhere in the planes. Some lesser deities live on the material plane, as does the unicorn goddess Leru of the Forgotten Realms and the titanic shark god Shekola, revered by the Sahuagin. Others live on the outer planes, as Lolth does in the abyss. Such deities can be encountered by mortals. Next, we have the quasi-deities. Quasi-deities have a divine origin, but they don't hear or answer prayers, grant spells to clerics, or control aspects of mortal life. They are still immensely powerful beings, and in theory, they could ascend to godhood if they amassed enough worshippers. Quasi-deities fall into three subcategories: demigods, titans, and vestiges. So, notice that the quasi-deities don't grant spells. So if you're playing a cleric or a paladin or something like that, that's worshiping a god and receiving spells, then by definition, that god is either a lesser or a greater deity. And I'll also point out that, these classifications have changed through the editions of D&D. For instance, in earlier editions, there were intermediate deities between greater and lesser deities, and the way that these different levels were defined have changed. So this is the way we're defining them now in 5th edition. So back to the quasi-deities, we have demigods. Demigods are born from the union of a deity and a mortal being. So basically half-gods. They have some divine attributes, but their mortal parentage makes them the weakest quasi-deities. Next we have titans. Titans are the divine creations of deities. They might be birthed from the union of two deities, manufactured on a divine forge, born from the blood spilled by a god, or otherwise brought about through divine will or substance. And finally, we have vestiges. Vestiges are deities who have lost nearly all their worshippers and are considered dead from a mortal perspective. Esoteric rituals can sometimes contact these beings and draw on their latent power. So, my gods of Primordia right now, I actually conceptualize as kind of a combination of the greater and lesser deities, which is not to say that they're, quote, intermediate deities. They just have aspects of both. And honestly, they don't have stats for the gods in 5th edition, so it's not really important from a mechanical or gameplay perspective to pin a god down on, is it lesser or is it greater? It's more of a way to help you conceptualize the god and decide what this god is like. So my gods of Primordia are like greater deities in that they are beyond mortal understanding, and in that they manifest avatars, but slaying one of those avatars doesn't really have any impact on the god itself. However, they have things in common with lesser deities as well, in that they are embodied somewhere on the planes. The gods of Primordia do have a, quote, physical existence somewhere. It may be in the world somewhere, it may be on an outer plane, or it may be somewhere else, but that god does exist somewhere. And they are like lesser deities in that they can be encountered by mortals. So I think the idea here in 5th edition is that with a greater deity, that deity is more like a force, and you can't directly encounter that deity, although you might encounter an avatar of the deity. However, a lesser deity, you can actually come face to face with that deity itself, not just an avatar of it. So like I said, my gods are kind of a combination of the two, which is totally fine. So that is the conclusion of the discussion on religions in this part of the DMG, and that's where we'll end our discussion today. The next part of the DMG starts talking about mapping your campaign and creating settlements and all that good stuff. So we'll discuss all of that in a future episode. Well, that is going to wrap it up for us for episode 154 of Game Master's Journey. If you would like to get a hold of me, please visit the website, starwalkerstudios.com. There you can email me, find my Twitter, Google+, Facebook, Pinterest, and YouTube information, and also the Game Master's Journey voicemail number where you can call and leave me a message. If your question or feedback is entertaining or enlightening, or both, you may even hear your message on the show. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future topics, I would love to hear from you. Also at starwalkerstudios.com, you can find a link to the Game Master's Journey community where you can share ideas with other listener GMs. Finally, you can learn about how you can support the show by becoming a patron, by making a one-time donation, by using my Amazon referral link when you shop on Amazon, or by purchasing my D&D adventure, The Trickster's Labyrinth. You can find all this and more at starwalkerstudios.com. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.